So, picking up where we left off, the death of Muhammad left the Muslim community with some pretty big shoes to fill as far as the leadership. So, what ended up happening is essentially the more important individuals within the community came together in consultation and then more or less voted on who they felt should be the successor to Muhammad as the head of the Muslim community. They chose his closest friend and one of the earliest converts, Abu Bakr, who took the title Khalifat Rasul Allah. Literally, the term Khalifat, in English, we would say the caliphate. The individual would be the caliph, the successor in full of the messenger of God. Right? So very often we refer to the leader of the Muslim community during this period simply as the caliph. So the immediate problem confronting the Muslim community was, after Muhammad died, there were quite a few that no doubt joined his movement out of a sincere conviction to the new faith. But for some it was more that Muhammad had proven such an effective leader that they were drawn to him. So kind of a feeling that now that he had passed on, well, that was fun, but time to move on to the next thing. So the first thing was to kind of reconsolidate control of the Arab tribes, many of whom had broken with the Ummah following Muhammad's death. So this was Abu Bakr's primary concern upon taking the leadership. Most of the tribes he was able to bring back into the fold through diplomacy. There were a few where they had to actually to come to blows with, but eventually he was able to bring them all back in. But he did understand one thing with the Arab tribes, that for better or worse, there was a tremendous amount of combative energy that needed to find an outlet, and so this would be directed to the north, where very quickly they would begin creating this new empire that would encompass much of the Middle East. Now, as you can see from the dates, Abu Bakr only reigned from 632 to 634, for only 2 years before he died. He was succeeded by Umar ibn alKhattab, who had been a close companion of the Prophet, like Abu Bakr, and he would reign for the next 10 years. His reign would come to an end with his assassination. But pretty much he's going to continue the policies initiated by Abu Bakr of conquering territory. It's under his rule that Palestine, Syria, Egypt, and Cyrenaica, which is roughly in today's Libya, were captured. And within a century, the Muslim empire would extend from Spain in the west as far as the borders of China in the east. We already learned about the Battle of the Talas River, and that's pretty much where they stopped expanding. So, just think about this. Within the space of 100 years, this new empire had been created on the basis of this new religion that extended all the way from Spain to China. If you had asked anyone around the time that Muhammad was born, say, someone in the Middle East, where do you think the next great empire is going to come from? If you had responded that would come from the deserts of Arabia, people would have thought that you were completely mad. Right? I mean, so this is a pretty remarkable thing. Now, as far as Umar ibn al-Khattab goes, he's also going to initiate policies with respect to non-Muslim populations. And I should note that it's going to be a long time before the majority of subjects within this new empire are actually Muslim. And that's worth actually thinking about, right? So, there's this kind of stereotype of people being forced to convert to Islam at the end of a sword, become a Muslim or die. And nothing could be further from the truth. From a pretty early point, and this actually even begins under Muhammad, particularly if you were a monotheist, the policy was one of toleration. You were pretty much allowed to carry on with your faith. You might be required to pay a special tax. You enjoyed the protection of Muslim government, a Muslim army. But beyond that, you were pretty much allowed to manage your own affairs. And again, particularly if you're talking about other monotheistic religions, Jews and Christians were designated peoples of the book. And we should point out that both the Jewish and Christian Bibles were considered and are considered by Muslims to be divinely sanctioned, but to have been corrupted, right? So, it's kind of the idea also in that regard that Muhammad had come to set the record straight. In a way, the Quran is kind of getting people back on the straight and narrow. The chief corruption with respect to Judaism was kind of, from the Muslim point of view, was this idea that the Jews were somehow a specially chosen people, or that prophets had to be Jewish. With respect to Christianity, the chief corruption was perceived to be the idea that Jesus was in fact God. And as I already mentioned, they definitely felt that Jesus was a prophet, that many of the stories related in the Christian Bible are in fact valid, but the idea that he was somehow God incarnate, um, particularly from the perspective of monotheism, right, the oneness and unity of God, they found this very problematic. I should note Jews also find that problematic. So Umar ibn alKhattab, in a sense, as he's kind of creating this new empire, they're confronted with how to deal with the vast number of subjects that are brought under their rule. I should note, he had a reputation for being extremely tough but fair. I like to call him the Clint Eastwood of very often the first four caliphs, who were all companions of Muhammad, known as the four righteous caliphs, of which he was one. So, very tough, not someone to mess around with, but he was definitely considered to be fair. And we can see in this map here, kind of get a sense of how rapidly growing in terms of territory this new empire is, right? So this is roughly around the time of Umar, and it's just going to continue to expand after his assassination. Now, part of how they deal with subject populations is they tend to try and keep the Arab armies separate from the native inhabitants. So as they expand, they establish these kind of garrison towns where they can station the Arab tribes, where they can kind of, keep a handle on the security in this territory recently conquered, but where they're not really going to interact with the native people. Many of the existing administrative structures are kept in place. I mean, why eliminate them and then have to create something new? And there is, also tremendous tolerance in terms of, different manners of government, pretty open-minded about whatever practices were already there when they got there. Some of these garrison towns will eventually evolve into cities. So a few early ones, you have Basra and Kufa in what today is Iraq. And those are both thriving cities today. And then you have Fustat in Egypt, which today is a neighborhood in Cairo. Cairo is actually going to be built later, very nearby, and eventually is going to surround Fustat and swallow it up. And again, the idea was kind of keeping the Arabs separate from the settled peoples. It was kind of felt that they would end up being corrupted if they interacted too much with city folk. There's this kind of strong correlation between Islam and values associated with life in the desert and so forth. And while they do keep administrative structures in place in the various cities that they bring under their authority, the highest posts will of course be awarded to leading members of the Arab tribes, Arab generals, and in particular Meccans are going to do very well in this regard. So we're talking about, for instance, if you have governorships of newly established provinces. And here we can see, just kind of some visuals of a few of these garrison towns. In the bottom there on the left, we have Basra. This is from around 1950. This is in the south of Iraq, very kind of swampy area near the opening to the Persian Gulf. And then in Cairo, if you go to the neighborhood, what is today the neighborhood of Fustat, like here you might find one of the earliest mosques, the Ibn Tulun Mosque, located there. So eventually, the majority of people in this newly created empire will convert to Islam, but it's going to be very slow going at first. So not only is there not really any compulsion, they're not putting pressure on people to convert. In some ways, they're actually discouraging conversion initially. So first of all, in some ways, they just don't want to mess with what's already there, right? Civil administrations are left mostly untouched. Many important positions are going to be held by Christians and Jews, and so they enjoy protection as peoples of the book. They're not to be harassed, but they're also to be defended. Some will begin to convert, though. But initially, there's kind of this idea that Islam is an Arab religion, and there's a bit of an elitist attitude about it. And so initially, if you want to become Muslim, there's kind of the idea that you first have to become Arab. You need to be given status as a client member of a particular Arab tribe in anticipation of conversion. The term they use for this individual, the singular would be Mawla. Mawali is the plural. So the idea is you kind of have to become an honorary Arab. And then once you're fully accepted as such, you might convert to Islam. But even then, there's a tendency to treat such individuals as kind of, secondary Muslims, not really being, somehow of equal status. And so, this is kind of interesting, again, considering the stereotype that people are being forcibly converted. Even by the time of the Crusades in the 11th, 12th centuries, you still aren't going to have a majority Muslim population within this empire. Now, having said that, probably the chief incentive to becoming Muslim increasingly will be that if you want to further your social and economic situation, or even achieve kind of high political office, is kind of incumbent upon you to become Muslim. And, if you're already a monotheist, it's not really that hard a jump. And in fact, there will be some kind of pushback on this discrimination against non-Arab Muslim, particularly as you start to have more and more of them, especially among Persian, Iranian people, who will probably end up at some point constituting the largest non-Arab element of the Muslim community. Well, after Umar, we have Uthman ibn Affan, and we have someone who was a companion of the Prophet, considered one of the four righteous caliphs. I should note that term righteous or rightly guided might be more correct. Reflects more that they knew Muhammad personally than anything about their own individual character. And in fact, Uthman proved to be a rather ineffective leader, right? So he took the reins of command in 644, when the year that Umar was assassinated. Again, this came about by way of consultation, what's known as a shura, where the more important members of the community came together to vote on who should be the successor. So here's the problem. And Uthman was a devoted Muslim. He had converted fairly early on, but he is a member of the Umayyad clan, which you might remember was, first of all, the dominant clan in Mecca back during the time of Muhammad. Second of all, that they had persecuted Muhammad and the early Muslim community. And third, they were pretty much the last to convert. Really only right at the end where, at that point it really would have been convert or die. So, I mean, this doesn't necessarily speak against Uthman. Again, he was, sincere in his conversion to the faith, but he was really torn, right? So, imagine that Uthman, on the one hand, he feels that he should have the welfare of the entire Muslim community foremost in his mind. On the other hand, his fellow clansmen, members of the Umayyad clan, are putting pressure on him to appoint members of his clan, to look out for his clan before anyone else. And this is kind of, old school. To appoint those individuals to the highest positions within this newly created empire. And at the end, he kind of ends up doing that, right? He seems a little bit too concerned with pleasing rich Meccan merchants, putting his kinsmen into high positions. Imagine that you are someone who had converted early on, you had been there right from the beginning, and you're being passed over for important governorships or military positions in favor of these Johnny-come-latelys. And this would create resentment. Also, at some point, they're starting to finally write down the various prophecies and collect them into one book, into the Quran. Initially, there are a number of different versions. Uthman is going to decide on which one is correct and destroy all other versions. And to be clear, I mean, very often very minor differences, but people feel very strongly about whichever Quran they favor. So, altogether, he's really turning a lot of people against him. And eventually, some of them descend upon his home in Mecca in 656 and assassinate him, according to the tradition, while he sat there reading the Quran. So now we need another caliph. The fourth caliph is going to be, again, one of the earliest converts, Ali ibn Abi Taleb. You might remember he was, it says there, Muhammad's nephew. Is actually his cousin. Apologies for that. He is the son of his uncle, Abu Talib, had converted early on, And another connection, he had married the daughter of Muhammad, Fatima, from whom he had two sons, Hassan and Hussein. So they are the grandsons of Muhammad, who had no surviving sons. So, in a sense, the nearest male descendants to Muhammad. And in fact, pretty much from the time of Muhammad's death, there were some who felt that Ali should have been the successor based on his relationship to Muhammad. And this is going to become the basis for a very important division that will emerge within Islam. There were some who felt that, Ali, by virtue of his being related to the Prophet, had almost quasi magical powers that would confer upon him an absolute religious and political authority, right? That he and his descendants, the line of descent from Muhammad through Ali, would in some sense have a perfect understanding of what Muhammad and what God, in fact, had intended for the Muslim community. So this will end up becoming the sect of Islam known as Shiism, literally coming from the term Shia, which means partisan, Shiite Ali, as those who supported Ali. The basis of this, right, these ideas about what kind of special religious authority he and his descendants had would evolve over time. But this idea, kind of had its seed right from the beginning in those who supported him becoming the caliph. Well, in any event, he is the caliph now. But pretty early on, he's challenged by one of Uthman's cousins, Muawiyah, who was the governor of Syria, right? So Muawiyah, very upset about the death of his cousin Uthman, a member of the Umayyad clan, and he's pretty much old school. So, he has this very strong sense of obligation to avenge the death of his cousin. So he basically calls upon Ali to turn over the individuals responsible, and everyone knows who they are, and they are strong supporters of Ali. And he's like, basically, I will not accept you as caliph or recognize you as such until you do that. Now, Ali can't really do this. This would be a very inauspicious way to begin his reign. Would kind of convey a sense of weakness. These are very important supporters of his. And this is going to lead to the first major conflict between Muslims, what's often referred to as Fitna, as in civil war. The two sides will meet in a series of skirmishes at a place called Siffin in northern Syria in 657. The encounter ends in a truce after Ali agrees to arbitration. The story goes that, in fact, Ali's side was winning, but then an advisor suggested to Muawiyah that he tell his men to put pages of the Quran on the tips of their spears and hold them aloft, in essence waving the white flag, and Ali agreed to this. And many on his side were quite upset with this. They felt that, that God favored him, that, who was even Ali to question what God had planned for him? He was winning after all. But from Ali's point of view, I think it was very difficult for him to, recognize that he was beginning his reign with Muslims killing Muslims, right? So in any event, he agreed to the arbitration. But this ended up being perceived as a sign of weakness, and eventually Ali was assassinated by one of his supporters, who was just very upset that he had accepted a negotiated settlement with Muawiyah. Now, Muawiyah is going to take advantage of this development. Following Ali's death, Muawiyah is able to bring the various Arab tribes under his authority. He has himself made caliph, and this marks the beginning of what is referred to as the Umayyad Caliphate, a reference to the clan. But in a sense, it's really kingship. From this point forward, the succession will pretty much be father to son, the way kingship works, or at least the eldest living male relative, right? So in one case, it might be a brother or something like this. And this is something actually that within Islam is heavily frowned upon, right? They often refer to this as being pharaonic, as something anti-ethical to Islamic values. But nonetheless, this is what does emerge. And so you end up with this Umayyad Caliphate that will govern from 715 until 750, as they continue to expand and create this new Islamic empire. And we sometimes refer to this as kind of marking the beginning of the period of the high caliphates, of which there will only be two, right? We have the Umayyad Caliphate, and that will be succeeded somewhat down the road, well, in 750, by the Abbasid Caliphate. And again, on a dynastic principle, right? Successorship going father to son. And so all of this, if you think about it, really happening shortly after Muhammad's death. The caliphate will come to an end with the Mongol invasion of the Middle East in the 13th century. So while they were wreaking havoc in China and East Europe, they're also doing the same in the Middle East. And again, both caliphates operating on the dynastic principle, something viewed in a very negative light within Islam, but at some point becomes kind of accepted as, that's just the way it is, where rulership passes from father to son and stays within the family. And again, there would be many among the early Muslim communities who really had a problem with this, and this sometimes would lead to rebellion. In one case, the overthrowing of the Umayyad Caliphate, but only to see its replacement by a new one. So in any event, right now the story is chiefly about Muslim expansion, the empire really growing rapidly under the Umayyad armies that are pushing across North Africa and then into Iran. The Sassanid ruling dynasty will almost collapse in a matter of weeks. Again, partly because the population really didn't have any major commitment to the ruling elite there. And then the empire will continue to expand into what today is Pakistan, and eventually also in the West, bringing pretty much all of what today is Spain and Portugal under Muslim rule. So we see, this incredibly huge empire created in a very short period of time, meaning also you have a diverse array of peoples who are brought under its rule. And again, the policy is one of toleration, both with respect to religion, but also in terms of governmental practice. And so here you get kind of an idea of the expanse of this new Islamic empire, or might say caliphate if you want, as a reflection of the kind of political institution at the top. Again, the policy is one of toleration, and some of this reflects kind of practical considerations. Ruling a vast empire is not easy, and right from the start, it really makes much more sense to take advantage of local talent than do anything that might suppress it, to keep administrative structures in place, to keep those people who are actually doing the administering in place, and allowing them to do it the way they had been doing it even before you came in. Christians, in fact, will be heavily employed during this period. And in some ways, that probably represents the majority of religion if you're talking about the number of practitioners. This is especially true in what today is Syria. And they also become very important in other regards, in the development of the Arabic language, for instance, as a language of administration, as a political language, as one equipped to deal with intellectual pursuits. They will initiate a process of translating a tremendous amount of Greek and Roman philosophy into Arabic, much of which would have been lost otherwise. Eventually, some of that will be translated back into European languages. So playing a very important role in that regard. Now, probably the most important development with respect to Islam during this period is going to be the kind of schism that emerges whereby Islam is divided into two major sects. The vast majority, 90% of Muslims today, are what we call Sunni Muslims, but about 10% fall into another group known as Shiites. And in some ways, the development of Shiism really defines the nature of this schism. Sunnism, in many regards, kind of will begin to develop in opposition to Shiism, right? The idea, well, Shiites believe one thing, we don't believe that. Well, what is it that we do believe, right? So we really need to kind of start with a consideration of Shiism. Now, in some ways, right from the start, Shiism is a kind of movement of opposition to Umayyad rule, right? There are many who have strong feelings about how the succession to the caliphate should have gone. There are many people who are unhappy with Umayyad rule. If you're not happy with Umayyad rule, you might imagine that things would have been much better if only someone related to Muhammad had been the successor, had been the first caliph, right? And at some point, this kind of belief centers on Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad, and then the descendants of Muhammad through the line of Ali, right? And in fact, Ali had been caliph for a very short period, but as we already discussed, had been unable to consolidate his authority and had lost out to the founder of the Umayyad dynasty, Muawiyah. So here it is, early days in the Umayyad dynasty, large numbers of Muslims not happy. I mean, first of all, among the earliest Muslims, just kind of resenting that the Umayyads are again in charge. I mean, they were, the last to convert to Islam, had held out, had actually persecuted Muhammad. You're not happy about this kind of dynastic element where a succession goes from father to son. Perhaps you were a supporter of Ali. So there are many people looking for someone to provide leadership whom they might rally around to overthrow the Umayyads, and eventually they settle, not surprisingly, on the son of Ali, Hussein. Full name Hussein ibn Ali ibn Abi Taleb, ibn meaning son of, right? So we can kind of see the whole line of descent there from the uncle who had looked out for Muhammad, through his son Ali, one of the earliest converts, now to the grandson of Muhammad, Hussein. And so at some point, more specifically, there's an indication of, tremendous potential resort in Kufa, this garrison town up in what today is Iraq. And so at some point, Ali marches off from Mecca, headed to Kufa, with a small band of about 70 supporters. The idea is when he gets to Kufa, he'll kind of pull these together, his supporters there into an army, and then they can march off to Damascus, now the capital of the Islamic world, Damascus in what today is Syria, and overthrow the Umayyads. Unfortunately for Hussein, word gets back to the Umayyads, and they send a rather large army to intercept Hussein and his followers, roughly around a place called Karbala, which you can see on the map there, again in roughly what today is Iraq. This happens in 680, and this ends up being a battle of disproportions, about, roughly an army of 1,000 versus Hussein and his 70 followers. I think it's not too hard to guess how that turns out. Hussein and his small band of warriors are defeated and destroyed. Hussein's head is cut off and sent back to Damascus to show that the deed was done. And from the point of the Umayyads, this is a rather minor skirmish, but this becomes one of the foundational events in the development of Shiism. So today in Shiism, they commemorate this event as not when, and so what happened with the supporters in Kufa? They just disappeared into the woodwork, like who, us? We never said anything. And there's this kind of feeling of guilt and remorse that his supporters weren't there for him in his hour of need. But Shiites express it in the present tense, right? That we were not there for Hussein. We failed him in his moment of need. So again, from the point of view of the Umayyad dynasty or a caliphate, a rather insignificant battle, but an extremely important event in the development of Shiism. Hussein, in some ways, probably the most important figure for Shiites after Muhammad. And this also, we see really kind of a establishment of this idea of the Imam. So this is a term we really need to very briefly explain, right? So they have this kind of idea that descendants of Muhammad through the line of Ali had almost quasi-mystical powers that would have made them ideally suited to leadership, where they would have a almost perfect knowledge of Islam, of what Muhammad had intended for the Muslim community, indeed what God had intended. And the term they use for these individuals is Imam, right? So Ali would have been the first Imam, Hussein the second, and then onward down the line in succession. So, they're starting to develop this idea. Hussein also is seen as a martyr, right? So his supporters in Kufa, not only, did he fail to get to Kufa, they never came to him in his hour of need. They pretty much disappeared into the woodwork. And so this kind of idea that, the Shiites had failed Hussein in his hour of need. This event, the Battle of Karbala, is commemorated every year during the month of Muharram by Shiites. And it's obviously, not a happy occasion, right? It's a period during which many Shiites bemoan, and they never talk about in the past tense, like when his supporters failed to show up. They talk about when we failed to show up, right? As if this is kind of a recurring event, and they bemoan, our present-day lack of courage. They sometimes engage in self-flagellation and so forth. So Shiites view Hussein as a model of courage and resistance that they should imitate, whatever the tyranny might be. Back then it was the Umayyad tyranny, maybe more recently it was the tyranny of the Iranian Shah Mohammad Reza. Hussein really becoming in some ways kind of a defining figure in the development of Shiism. So that didn't really work out, obviously, but there are still many people unhappy with Umayyad rule and who would like to see them replaced. And eventually they're going to rally around a different individual. It's kind of an interesting story, but at some point people are really looking for someone descended from Muhammad to kind of lead the way, to help overthrow the Umayyads and establish a kind of just Muslim society. And so one day a fellow named Abu Muslim shows up in the eastern part of roughly what today is Iran and gathers together those opposed to the Umayyad and claims to represent the one true Imam, right? Someone descended from Muhammad, but he's very coy about the nature of that relation. And allows people to imagine that he is in fact talking about someone descended from Muhammad through the line of Ali. Eventually, he's able to create an army out of this, and they succeed in overthrowing the Umayyads. It's only at that point that he reveals who the Imam is. It's not someone descended through the line of Ali. It is, in fact, someone related to Muhammad through Muhammad's paternal uncle, al-Abbas. And the Imam's name is a fellow named Ibrahim ibn Muhammad. And you'll note that I use the term proto-Shiites because Shiism is still kind of evolving in terms of specific beliefs they have. But in any event, as you might imagine, many are quite disappointed to discover that they weren't following the person they thought they were. But by that point, we have a new caliphate in place. They take their name Abbasids from this idea that they're descended from the uncle of Muhammad. And almost immediately, they're going to adopt mainstream Islamic practice, what eventually will become Sunnism, and begin to persecute Shiites. So you could say they used them in order to obtain power, and then when they got what they wanted, basically threw them under the bus. Well, the Abbasid Caliphate is going to mark an important shift in a number of ways. First of all, they're going to create a new capital, Baghdad. So it's a kind of built capital. It's actually, the proper name is Dar es-Salam, or Realm of Peace, but is very near a village called Baghdad and eventually takes the name. And that, of course, will be located much further to the east in what today is Iraq, meaning that it is now going to experience a much greater degree of Iranian culture. The capital under the Umayyads had been in Damascus in Syria. So again, it's kind of a major cultural shift as Persian and Semitic cultures or Arab cultures are going to fuse together into something entirely new. We should note the Abbasids still consider themselves primarily Arab, but we do really have a growing Persian influence in the form of government. There's also kind of, as more and more Iranians or Persians are converting to Islam, they're starting to have a much greater influence over the culture and over kind of intellectual developments and so forth. But in any event, the Abbasid Caliphate does in some ways represent the high point of this new Islamic civilization, right? When things are really flourishing. And it does also mark the period where we have this kind of decisive split into Sunnism versus Shiism. As I noted, almost immediately upon taking power, the Abbasids adopted the kind of mainstream practice, which really corresponded to Sunnism. So for them, they really, as I mentioned, Sunnism in some ways developing as a response to Shiism. Well, in one way that's obvious is that they completely reject this idea that somehow the descendants of Muhammad had any special qualities that made them somehow best suited to the leadership of the Ummah. They rejected this, what from their point of view seemed both a kind of dynastic principle, but also, there's this kind of idea that Muhammad is the final prophet, and it seemed that these imams, descendants of Muhammad, had almost kind of prophetic powers. And this will come to constitute the mainstream of Islam, what roughly 90% of Muslims practice today, known as Sunnism. They're much more flexible as far as the standard of leadership. They don't have any ideas that, one, it should be a descendant of Muhammad, and two, that this would confer upon them any special qualities. Uh, those who maintain that belief will become Shiites. Again, they were very disappointed to discover that the leader of the revolt was not a direct descendant of Muhammad. But you will have this line of imams that will carry on. The vast majority of Shiites today are what we call Twelvers, meaning they feel there were 12 imams in succession who never held real power, but often they looked to for any kind of religious guidance, if that was permitted under the Abbasid caliphs. Um, and they always imagined that if only this imam had had real power, things would have been much better, right? The 12th Imam, the belief evolves that that individual didn't die but went into a state of hiding, and that he will return at the end of days. So we won't go into that in a lot of detail, but again, the majority of Shiites, and Iran is probably the biggest Shiite majority state on the planet, right? So the majority of those are Twelvers. So just by way of kind of summarizing, Sunnism, the largest denomination in Islam, inasmuch as they reject the idea of the imamate, that you have an imam who would have perfect knowledge of Islam, that leaves them confronted with the problem of, well, how do you know how to behave as a good Muslim? And so they turn to the example of the Prophet, what they call the Sunnah of the Prophet. The idea that by looking at how Muhammad behaved, advice that he gave to members of the earliest Ummah, you can know how to behave now. You could say, sometimes Christians will say, what would Jesus do? So it's a kind of what would Muhammad do? And again, the term they use is Sunnah. That's where we get the term Sunni or Sunnism. More specifically, we're going to see the collecting of traditions about things Muhammad said and did, known as hadith. And that's what they look to for specific examples, right? I mean, Sunnah kind of referring to the normative practice of Muhammad, that he was generous, that he was fair, and so forth. The Hadith are specific stories about things that actually happened in his life that you might look to provide kind of a role model for what you should do in your own. Shiism, making up roughly 10% of Muslims worldwide. Again, the term coming from the broader expression Shi'at Ali, meaning the supporters of, or partisans of Ali. They will remain the minority. So probably the high watermark of Abbasid rule would be under the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the fourth Abbasid Caliph. This was 786 to 809. And under his rule, this is definitely kind of a high point for Baghdad in just about every regard. I think I mentioned that if you were to go back in time to this period, you probably would want to go to either Chang'an in China or Baghdad in what is today Iraq. It really is, was like an incredibly splendid city, a center of learning, a cultural center. We're seeing this kind of fusion between Persian and Arab cultures, particularly as Persians are now beginning to actively assert themselves. At some point, they're even dominating the bureaucracy. And by the way, Harun al-Rashid, if you ever read the book of 1001 Arabian Nights, he features quite prominently, and certainly they paint these, very lustrous pictures of what the court life was like in Baghdad at the time. You have this kind of Beit al-Hakam, or House of Wisdom, where you have intellectuals of all religious backgrounds coming together to debate the issues of the day, philosophy, scientific developments, and so forth. Here we actually see Harun al-Rashid receiving a delegation from Charlemagne, the most important ruler in Europe at the time. And really, I mean, by comparison, Europe, just descending into the heart of the Middle Ages, there is a reason why they sometimes refer to it as the Dark Ages. We'll be learning more about that in our next lecture. But in any event, this definitely would have been, kind of from a civilizational point of view, Middle East would have been far superior to anything in Europe at the time. And here we see kind of the extent of the Abbasid Empire at the time of Harun al-Rashid. I should note at this time, Spain had actually kind of broken off and gone its own way with a remaining survivor from the Umayyad caliphate. But for the most part, this is where it's at this point. Now, after Harun al-Rashid, the actual power of the caliph is going to begin to decline. Some of the caliphs had actually claimed to have some kind of religious authority, but we're going to see that shift away to a body of religious scholars known as the Ulama, what constitute the clergy in Islam. And we should note, in Islam, there is no kind of ultimate religious authority like, a pope in the Catholic Church. Meaning that different members of the ulama might arrive at different rulings, might refer to different hadith or the same hadith in different ways in terms of coming up with different religious rulings, different interpretations, and this is all considered perfectly legitimate. There is this kind of point where the caliph will try to maintain religious authority against them and challenge their authority, but ultimately the ulama will win out, leaving the caliph with only political authority, but that eventually will decline as well, particularly as they start to bring in more mercenary armies made up of Turks from Central Asia, some of whom will eventually assert their own power. And they end up taking on the title of Sultan, right? So it started out with these Turkish kind of mercenaries coming in, and they would end up being brought together to form these kind of slave armies known as Mamluks, in theory dedicated to the caliph, but at some point becoming extremely powerful. And before long, you see the political fragmentation of the Muslim world into various states, each one under a different sultan, with the caliph becoming little more than a kind of figurehead, kind of like a monarch in a constitutional monarchy. In this case, representing in a kind of theoretical or abstract sense the unity of the Muslim world, but without any real political authority, right? It's the sultans that end up having political authority and the ulama having religious authority. And eventually, again, this corresponds with a kind of fragmenting of the empire into a number of smaller states where in some cases it could be the governor of a province claiming the title sultan. Later on, in some cases, it might be the military commander actually taking over even Baghdad, where they keep the caliph in place as a figurehead, but they have the actual political authority. Again, religious authority lying in the hands of the ulama, political authority in the hands of the sultans, and then eventually the caliphate itself coming to an end with the Mongol invasion, right? This marks the end of the Abbasid Caliphate when in 1258 the Mongols lay siege to Baghdad, they destroy much of it, and then they actually take not just the caliph but his entire family, roll them up in carpets, and trample them to death with horses. Again, this is in 1258, and from that point onward, you have no longer a caliphate. There will be some attempts to kind of revitalize it or lay claim to the title, but it really never has any major significance after this event. And that is a pretty good place to stop our discussion of developments in the so-called Islamic world. We will shortly turn to Europe, and please do make sure to do the quiz.